Corinne Whitmore, had signed away $11 million before 9 that morning without her pulse changing. Elias Novak had spent the same hour on his knees in bilge water, up to his elbows in a stranger's engine, trying to keep a 40-year-old diesel from dying in the middle of Miller's Cove. Neither of them knew yet that the two facts belonged in the same sentence. What happened between them over the following 6 weeks would not resemble anything either of them had planned for, and by the time it was finished, one of them would have given away the only house that still hurt to think about. And the other would have learned that the woman he loved had been watching him through a camera bolted to a fence post. It started, as these things sometimes do on the Atlantic coast, with a boat that wouldn't start. The Whitmore Harbor Inn sat at the mouth of the cove like it had grown there, cedar shingles gone silver gray, its dock stretching out into water so clear in September that you could count the mussels on the pilings. Corinne owned it, along with 11 others strung along the coast from Lunenburg to the Cabot Trail, a quiet empire she'd built out of the wreckage of a much smaller one. She didn't usually come down to the dock herself. She had people for that. But the inn's excursion boat, the one that took guests out to see the seals on the ledges, had stalled twice that week, and her manager had called someone named Novak because, he said, if anyone in this county can talk that engine back to life, it's him. Corinne came down in her coat, meaning to observe for 5 minutes and go back to her spreadsheets. She stayed 40. He was already elbow-deep in the engine well when she arrived, a big man in a canvas jacket gone soft with age, dark hair graying at the temples, moving with the unhurried patience of someone who had never once in his life been in a hurry that mattered. He didn't look up when her shadow fell across the boat. "You the one who called about the boat, or the one who owns it?" he said. "Both." "Then you're going to want to know it's not the starter. Everybody guesses starter. It's the fuel line. Somebody's been putting off cleaning the tank for about 3 years." He said it without judgment, the way a doctor reads a chart. "That would be my dock manager's problem, not mine. Everything on this dock's your problem. That's what owning it means." He finally glanced up. His eyes were a flat, unimpressed gray, the kind that didn't do the thing men's eyes usually did when they learned who she was. "You want to know what it'll cost, or you want me to just fix it and send the invoice to the office like everyone else does?" "Send it to the office," figured. He went back to the engine. She should have walked away then. She told herself later, many times, that she should have walked away then. Instead, she stood on the dock in her good coat and watched a man work with his hands for longer than she had watched anything in years, and when he finally straightened up, wiped his palms on a rag, and said the boat would run fine by Saturday, she heard herself ask his name as if she hadn't already read it off the work order. "Elias Novak, Corinne Whitmore." "I know," he said, not unkindly. "Your name's on the sign." He picked up his toolbox and left without asking her anything else, and she stood on the dock feeling, for the first time in longer than she could easily account for, like an ordinary woman who had been looked at and found unremarkable. It was the strangest gift anyone had given her in a decade. She had learned, over 17 years of building Whitmore Harbor out of almost nothing, to read men within the first minute of meeting them. There was the kind who wanted the company. There was the kind who wanted to be seen wanting nothing, which was its own kind of wanting. There was the rare, dangerous kind who wanted her specifically, and those were the ones she watched hardest, because that particular hunger had cost her everything once. At 23, when a man named Preston Vale had smiled at her across a boardroom table and told her he believed in her vision more than anyone ever had. She had believed him. She had been young enough to, while her mother, Helen, lay dying of a cancer that moved through her faster than anyone expected. In a hospital in Sydney with a view of a parking lot, Corinne had signed papers Preston put in front of her without reading past the signature line, because she was 23 and terrified and grateful, someone else seemed willing to carry the business, while she sat by a bed, holding a hand that grew lighter every day. By the time her mother died, the company's seed money had gone through 6 shell accounts and out of the country, and Preston Vale had gone with it. And Corinne Whitmore had learned, in the space of one terrible spring, the 2 lessons that would build the rest of her life: that she could survive losing everything, and that she must never again let anyone close enough to take it. She had rebuilt, then rebuilt again, larger. Every man who'd come near her in the years since had, without knowing it, been auditioning for a part he didn't know he was up for, and every one of them had eventually shown her the same flicker. A glance that lingered half a second too long on a number. A question about the business dressed up as concern. And she had let them go with the same clean efficiency she used to close those underperforming properties. Elias Novak did not audition. He fixed the engine, sent the invoice for exactly what the parts and his time were worth, and did not come back to the inn unless he was called. She called him again 11 days later for a generator that was working fine. He found the fault anyway, a loose connection he tightened in 90 seconds, and stood in the boathouse afterward looking at her with an expression that wasn't quite a smile. "You know this generator wasn't broken." "I don't know anything about generators." "No," he agreed. "But you know this one wasn't broken." He wiped his hands. "If you want to have a coffee sometime, Ms. Whitmore, you're welcome to just say so. Save yourself the service calls." She laughed before she could stop herself, a short, startled sound she hadn't heard come out of her own throat in years, and said, "Coffee." They had coffee at a place he chose, a diner in Carrow's Landing, with vinyl booths and pie in a rotating case, and then they had it again, and then dinner, which she paid for, because he didn't pretend to be able to afford the wine list, and didn't pretend to be ashamed of that either. Over the following weeks, she learned him the way you learn a coastline, one cove at a time. He was 46. He'd been a widower for 18 years. His wife, Dana, had died of a brain aneurysm on an ordinary Tuesday, when their daughter, Naomi, was 6 years old, and he had raised the girl alone in a 2-bedroom house above the marina, working the boatyard by day and reading her to sleep by night, teaching himself diesel mechanics when the fishing work dried up because it paid better and let him be home for supper. Naomi was 24 now, an engineer working out west in Calgary, and she called every Sunday at 6. He answered every Sunday at 6, and the rest of the week his house was very quiet. "What do you do with the quiet?" Corinne asked him once, over pie neither of them was eating. "Fix things that don't strictly need fixing," he said. "Same thing you do with a generator, come to think of it." He wasn't smiling when he said it, but something in his eyes was, and she felt the old familiar reflex rise in her chest, the urge to find the crack in him, and underneath it, for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, a second and much quieter urge not to look for one at all. She had a house she had not told anyone about in 14 years. It sat 2 hours up the shore from Miller's Cove, past Carrow's Landing, on a point of land her mother had bought in 1988 with the first real money Helen Whitmore had ever made, teaching piano to half the children in 3 counties and saving every extra dollar for a decade. Helen had raised Corinne in that house until Corinne left for business school, and Helen had died in the back bedroom on a Thursday in November, and Corinne had walked out the front door the next morning, locked it, handed the key to a caretaker, and never gone back. The caretaker had quit after 6 years. The lawns had gone to hay. The old apple tree Helen had planted the spring. Corinne turned 9 had died sometime around year 11, and Corinne knew it had died because a neighbor had mailed her a kind, careful letter about it, which she had read once and filed in a drawer and never answered. On her company's books, the property sat under a numbered holding company. In her own mind, it sat under a word she had stopped letting herself use out loud. The house was worth $5 million now, easily, for the land alone. She had not listed it. She had not visited it. She had not said her mother's name to another person in almost 9 years. She told Elias she had a property she wanted a tradesman's opinion on. Before she brought in architects, he asked what kind of property. She said an old one, up the shore, and he said sure, the way he said most things, without asking anything he didn't need to know yet. He sat in the passenger seat of her car for the first time on the drive up and didn't comment on the leather, or the fact that the car cost more than he made in 4 years, or the silence that settled over her the closer they got to the turnoff. He looked out at the spruce going by and asked, once, "You grow up around here?" "Close enough," she said, and something in her voice must have told him not to push because he didn't. The driveway had gone to gravel and weeds. The porch sagged on the east end. The front door was the same door. Her mother had painted a deep forest green the spring before the diagnosis. Corinne parked and did not get out right away. When she finally spoke, she used the voice she reserved for closing negotiations. "Land alone is worth about $5 million. The structure's a teardown at this point, honestly. I want a tradesman's eyes on the bones before I decide." She watched his face when she said the number, the way she had watched every man's face for 20 years, waiting for the flicker. He looked at the porch instead. "Shame," he said. "Bones look honest under all that." Then he got out of the car. He didn't go near the water view, the part of the property any developer would have photographed first. He went to the house. He climbed the porch steps, testing each board with his weight, laid a palm flat against the doorframe the way you'd check a person for fever, and stepped inside without waiting to be asked, because she hadn't told him he needed to ask. The house swallowed him into its gray light. She followed. It smelled of dust and cold wood, and, faintly, something floral that had no business still being there. He stood in the middle of the front room and didn't look at square footage. He looked at the water stain blooming across the ceiling, the crack running through the bay window, the pale rectangle on the wallpaper where a piano had once stood and been taken away. He went into the kitchen and ran a thumb along a chip in the counter. He went out the back door to the yard and stopped in front of a gray, leafless skeleton of a tree and stood there a long time, saying nothing. "Who lived here before?" he asked, when he finally came back inside. She opened her mouth. Nothing came. He waited. When it was clear nothing was coming, he nodded once, gently, as though he'd gotten an answer anyway. "It was loved," he said. "You can always tell. Thanks for showing it to me." On the drive back, he said almost nothing, and when she dropped him at his door, he leaned back in before he closed it and said, "Thank you, Corinne, for letting me see it." It was the first time he'd used her first name without the Ms. attached. And she drove home and sat in her coat on the edge of her bed until the sky went from black to a flat Atlantic gray. For 2 days she went to work as though nothing had happened, ran her meetings, closed a deal on a property in Lunenburg, and came home each night unable to remember the color of his eyes and able only to remember how they had gone still in front of the dead tree. On the 3rd day, her assistant, Farah Lindqvist, sharp, careful, 5 years in Corinne's employ, and trained never to open a folder she hadn't been told to open, came into the office with exactly that, a thin, unopened folder, and set it on the desk. "You asked me to keep half an eye on him. I did. He went to the Carrow's Landing Heritage Society archive yesterday. Stayed almost 2 hours. Asked to see the old property assessments for the Whitmore Point address and the local paper's archive going back to the 80s. Corinne's hand went still on her pen. He asked for records, deeds, assessments, and the paper. He didn't hide it. The archivist said he was friendly, wrote things down in a little notebook the whole time. Farah hesitated. A beat, longer than she usually allowed herself. There's no reason a man in his line of work needs deed history on a property, not unless he's thinking about it. Boundaries, lions, what it's actually worth to somebody. Corinne nodded once. Nothing moved in her face. Something inside her chest, built carefully over 2 decades, folded in on itself in a single silent collapse. "Keep watching," she said. How closely? Cameras. Front gate and the boathouse at the point. Nothing inside. I want to know if he goes back. He went back that Saturday. The footage reached her private server Sunday morning, and she watched it alone with the curtains drawn. He arrived in his truck a little after 10, parked outside the gate, and never went in. He stood at the fence with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the house for the better part of 40 minutes. He didn't photograph it. He didn't touch the padlock. He simply stood there, still as he'd been in front of the tree, and then got back in his truck and drove away. She watched it 3 times. Each time, the part of her built out of the ruin Preston Vale had left behind read the same sentence under his stillness. He is planning, he is measuring, he is waiting. Each time, the part of her that had sat beside him in his old truck and heard him say, "Thank you for letting me see it," read a different sentence entirely, and the two would not sit still together in the same head. She chose the first one. It was the sentence that had kept her alive this long. That night, at 9:20, she called him. Corinne. He answered on the second ring, and something in the way he said her name made the next part harder, which only made her say it faster. "I think we should stop seeing each other." A long quiet on the line. Not a wounded quiet. The quiet of a man taking in a piece of information and deciding calmly what to do with it. "All right," he said finally. "I won't ask you to explain it. Don't imagine it'd help either of us." "That's it? That's all you have to say? You didn't ask me a question, Corinne. You told me how it's going to be. I'm not going to fight you for your own life." A pause. "Thank you for the time. I mean that. Elias, take care of yourself." He hung up before she did, and it was, she realized, sitting on the floor of her closet 2 hours later, still holding the phone, the first time in a very long while that a man had ended a call with her rather than the other way around. She told herself over and over that his calm was the calm of a man who'd already been caught, already moved on to the next mark. Preston had wept on her kitchen floor the night she confronted him. Elias had said all right. The sentence was supposed to feel like proof. It felt, instead, like a wound she couldn't locate. 6 days later, a small padded envelope arrived at the Whitmore Harbour head office, addressed to her in block handwriting, no return address. Farah set it on the desk before lunch. Corinne opened it with the letter opener she used on everything. Inside, wrapped in a single sheet of plain paper, was a small brass ship's clock, the kind meant for a mantle or a boat's wheelhouse, the glass cracked at one corner, the brass gone dull with age. She knew it before she'd finished lifting it out. It was her mother's. The one that had sat on the mantel in the front room her whole childhood, the one Helen had kept running by hand because she liked the sound of it in the evenings. The one that had stopped. Corinne now remembered with a jolt like cold water. On the mantel of house the last morning she'd ever walked through the door, because no one had wound it since. She hadn't even known she'd noticed it on the mantel that day she brought Elias through. She must have. He must have picked it up while she was outside behind him, looking at the tree. He'd taken it home, cleaned it, repaired whatever small dead thing inside it had stopped it from keeping time. Wound it, set it, watched it run, for however many days a careful man watches a clock to be sure it's telling the truth. Then packed it and sent it back with no note, because a note would have been asking for something. It was running. She could hear the second hand ticking its small, patient circle against her desk. She sat with the office door shut and cried the way people cry who haven't had the practice. Badly in gulps, until Farah knocked twice, and getting no answer, quietly cleared the rest of the afternoon. 2 nights later, driving home from a dinner she hadn't wanted to attend, she took a route past the older streets near the boatyard that she told herself was only to avoid traffic on the bridge. At the corner by the hardware store she slowed for a light, and there he was. On the sidewalk outside a narrow apartment building, carrying 2 bags of groceries up a cracked set of front steps behind a stooped older man in a plaid coat who had to be 80, and was taking the stairs one at a time, one hand white-knuckled on the railing. Elias matched his pace exactly. Every time the old man took a step, Elias took a step. At the top, he set the bags down, held the door, picked the bags back up, and disappeared inside behind him. The light turned green. The car behind her honked. She didn't move. She pulled over half a block on and sat with the engine off, watching the door in her mirror. 4 minutes later, Elias came back out alone, empty-handed, not checking his phone, not glancing back, zipping his jacket against the wind and walking off toward the marina, whistling something too quiet to hear through the glass. No one had paid him for it. No camera had been rolling for it, except the one she'd had bolted to her own conscience for 6 weeks. No one had known she was watching. It had cost him 20 minutes of a cold evening and a sore back, and he had done it and walked away whistling, and she understood, with a clarity that arrived far too late to be any comfort, that the man she had decided was patiently planning. Something had been planning nothing more than how to get an old man's groceries up a flight of stairs. She went home. She poured a glass of wine and, for the first time in longer than she wanted to count, drank it. Then she went into her study and opened a drawer she hadn't opened since her mother died, and took out a thick file with one name written on the tab in her own younger handwriting. Vale P. It was the record she'd built in the months after Preston. The wire transfers, the falsified minutes, the private investigator's notes, the transcript of a deposition he'd never bothered to show up for. She read it now, not for evidence but for herself. And for the first time she saw what she'd never let herself see. Preston had told her who he was, in writing, months before he took anything. He'd told her in an offhand joke about a former partner that read now, in daylight, like a confession. She had seen it at the time. She had filed it under he doesn't mean it, because she was 23 and terrified of the hospital corridor waiting for her, and terrified more of being alone in it. The thing she had spent 20 years calling Preston Vale's betrayal was only half true. He had betrayed her, but she had also, quietly, chosen not to hear him, because hearing him would have meant facing her mother's death without a story to hold on to besides it. Both things were true. She had only ever been willing to look at the first one. Elias had not hurt her. Elias had simply refused to behave like a man who was about to, which was a different thing entirely, and her nervous system, trained on Preston Vale for 2 decades, had never learned to tell the two apart. She did not call him that night. She didn't feel she'd earned the right. Instead, on Saturday morning, almost 3 weeks after the phone call that ended it, she got in her car at 7 and drove up the shore to her mother's house, telling herself she was finally going to do the sensible thing, list it, sell it, close the chapter for good. His truck was parked outside the gate. She stopped on the shoulder and stared at it a full minute, and her first clear thought, strangely, was not anger. It was, of course, the gate was unlocked because she hadn't changed the lock in 14 years, and a patient man with his hands could work an old latch like that without trying. She walked around the side of the house and heard him before she saw him, the slow scrape of a rake through dry ground. He was in the back garden in a work jacket, clearing the space under the dead apple tree. On the porch steps beside him, weighted down with a stone, sat a small stack of papers, photocopies of old newspaper clippings, a hand-drawn sketch of a garden bed, a list of plant names in careful block print. He heard her before he turned. Thought you might come today. Why? You drove up here the first time on a Saturday. He set the rake against the trunk. People go back to the places that hurt them on the same day of the week. Couldn't tell you why. They just do. Elias. What are you doing here? He looked at the papers, then the tree, then finally at her, and his face wasn't angry, and it wasn't wounded the way she'd feared, and it wasn't tender in the way she hadn't let herself hope for either. It was tired, honest. The face of a man who'd decided to say one true thing and then stop. I was going to finish today and leave, he said. Wanted to see the place cleared once before somebody knocks it down. Went to the archive because I wanted to know what used to grow back here. The assessor's notes said cutting garden in the 60s, roses on the south side. Tree came later, planted the spring of 92, near as I can tell from the almanacs. Archivist helped me match the year. That's the only reason I asked for the deed at all. He didn't rush any of it. He wasn't making a case. My daughter's been gone 4 years now. Raised her right, I think. Good kid. Doesn't need me for much these days. I've been sitting in a quiet house waiting for Sunday at 6 ever since. The day you brought me here, I walked into that front room and the place was broken, but it was still standing, and I thought, maybe a thing can be broken and still be standing. Maybe that's not the worst thing a man can be. He picked the rake back up, came back because I wanted to see for myself whether it was worth putting back together. Wasn't going to buy it? I don't have that kind of money. Wasn't going to ask you for anything either. Just wanted to see. He turned back toward the tree. I'll be off the property in an hour. You won't hear from me again. Sorry if I overstepped. She stood on the ragged lawn of her mother's house wearing, without either of them noticing yet, the clarity of a woman who understood she had spent 2 decades standing in front of a mirror, and had finally been lucky enough to bring someone along who'd refused to become her reflection. Don't, she said. He stopped, the rake half in the dirt. Don't leave, please. He didn't turn. He let the rake rest and stood with his back to her, giving her room to say the rest without his face in the way of it. She took a breath that hurt the whole way down. This was my mother's house, Helen Whitmore. She bought it in 1988 with money she saved teaching piano 20 years running. She died in the back bedroom on a Thursday in November, and I walked out the next morning and never came back until the day I brought you here. I haven't said her name out loud to another person in almost 9 years. The clock you sent back, she kept that on the mantel my whole childhood. It stopped the morning she died because nobody wound it after. You fixed it. I don't know how to thank you for that. I'm not sure there is a way. He turned then, slowly. His face didn't soften. It only listened. I brought you here to test you, she said. You should know that, because you've earned the truth, and because if I don't say it out loud, I'll carry it another decade, and it'll rot everything else I touch. I told you the price on purpose. Watched your face for the same flicker I've watched for in every man since I was 23. Since a man named Preston Vale took my first company apart while my mother was dying, and I was too scared to see him doing it. When Farah told me you'd gone to the archive, I put cameras on this property, watched you stand at that gate for 40 minutes on a Saturday, and decided you were planning something. I ended it because I was certain. Being certain is the only way I've known how to stay standing. She didn't move closer. She didn't think she'd earned that either. I was wrong about you, she said. I've been wrong about plenty of men, but most of them earned the wrongness. You didn't. And the part I'm only understanding now is that I wasn't really testing any of you at all. I was testing whether I was allowed to want something again, and the answer I kept giving myself was no. You're the first person who wouldn't help me give it. He set the rake down properly, leaning it against the dead trunk. Why tell me this now? Because you were about to go, she said, and because you're owed the truth before you do. I put a camera on a man who was reading almanacs at the archive. I don't get to ask you for anything after that. She reached into her coat and drew out the ring of keys she'd carried up the driveway. The small brass one, worn smooth in the middle from 20 years in her mother's hand, and held it out across the raked dirt between them. These are the keys, she said. Front door, back door, the boathouse, the gate. If you want the place, it's yours. No paperwork today, no conditions. I'll sign it over Monday morning if that's what you decide. You don't owe me an answer standing here. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the clock's small tick from her pocket the only sound in the yard, the gray shape of the dead tree standing between them like something that had been waiting 14 years to be noticed. Then Elias crossed the space she hadn't dared to close and did not take the keys first. He took her hand instead, the one holding them, and folded his own around it, and said the only thing that mattered, quietly, the way he said everything. "I don't want the house without you in it." By the following spring, the apple tree had been cut down and a young one planted in its place. And if you drive up that shore road past Caro's Landing on a Saturday in September, you'll sometimes see a woman in a good coat sitting on a porch that no longer sags, and a man beside her with sawdust still on his sleeves, and neither of them watching the other's face for anything at all, because somewhere along the way, they'd both stopped needing to. If there's a lesson in it, it's probably this: the people worth keeping rarely announce themselves by passing a test. More often, they just keep showing up quietly, long after you've stopped watching to see if they will.